Hello. Well, of course, I can't let the day go by without talking about Mikhail Gorbachev, who led the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991. And he changed the world. He often said he was a true communist. He really did think that communism could work, and without dictatorship, it couldn't. And it didn't. When he let loose the chains binding both the surrounding client nations and the millions of citizens within Russia itself, the result was chaos, for which many Russian people did not forgive him. The 1990s were a terrible time for the average Russian citizen. I met some of them during that time, academics on conference visits. They looked undernourished, they were dressed in cheaply made, ill-fitting clothes, very often threadbare as well. I mean, it was just awful to see. And in general, they did look lost, even when they were talking about their favourite subjects and not at all about politics. It's difficult to describe how haunted they appeared. But I do remember feeling intensely sorry for their plight. They had an air about them of, I suppose it was humiliation. Those years were awful for the average Russian. It was full of economic collapse. Your earnings just disappeared overnight. There was piracy. There were gangsters and criminality everywhere. All services that had been taken for granted in the Soviet Union, bad as they were, disappeared completely. And as well as that, there was the collapse of everything they'd been taught about the progress of their powerful union and its political system. But that was the inevitable disruption that usually follows in the train of any revolution, and it was a revolution. And that revolution started on the morning of August the 19th, 1991, when Soviet citizens switched on their TV sets and their radios in the morning to find not the news, but a constant loop of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. The occasional announcements had it that Gorbachev was ill and the government was being run by the vice president, Gennady Yanayev. In fact, what was going on was a coup. During the evening before, Gorbachev, who was in his holiday home on the Black Sea, together with his wife, daughter, son-in-law and his two granddaughters, found the house surrounded and occupied by soldiers. A group of 8 hardline communists, at least nominally headed by the aforementioned Yanayev, had formed what they called an emergency committee. Having put Gorbachev under house arrest, they then ordered, the first thing they did was to order all the factories that they could to make as many handcuffs as was possible. And then they put out the story in the press and the media that Gorbachev was very ill and they'd been forced to take over. We didn't want to, but he couldn't rule anymore. That night, Gorbachev managed to fool the guards into thinking the whole family had gone to bed. And then, with the help of his son-in-law, he recorded a videotape delivering a speech that started, "A gross deception of the people has taken place and has become the basis for an anti-constitutional coup." You see, he did believe in the Constitution. And then he continued, "Everything that has been said by Comrade Yanayev and in documents of the committee is a gross deception, a fraud. In fact, a crime against the state has been committed." He recorded that same speech 4 times on the same videotape. Then he broke the cassette open and cut it into 4 pieces, giving 1 piece each to his secretary, an aide and his doctor. He kept the 4th one for himself, and one of those tapes found its way to state television, which broadcast it. That was in the days when Soviet state TV had a conscience, and at a time when coup plotters didn't realise such a devastating message could be smuggled out as a tiny roll of videotape, possibly, well, you know, inside a box of matches or even rolled into a cigarette. It was only a couple of minutes long, so it wouldn't have taken up much room at all. Those plotters were stuck in the 19th century. The apex of their strategy would have been to cut the phone lines and check for papers or letters being smuggled out. We can draw a parallel here with Putin, who appears to have had the same old-fashioned idea about the power of governments to invade, and thought he could follow the last century template of rolling tanks into the capital cities of neighbouring countries who were getting out of line, as had been done in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And we watched the broadcast. I mean, I was, you know, politically aware at the time. I was watching that clip. I looked for it on YouTube. I couldn't find it. But we were watching it in fascinated horror. This was the sort of thing you read in unlikely spy stories, and it didn't happen ever in real life, and yet there it was, happening. Nobody imagined that the strong, powerful and seemingly monolithic Soviet Union could descend into this, and with such speed. Gorbachev made his video, he made the recording over a tape of his ballet dancing little granddaughter. It was the sort of tape that any proud grandfather would treasure, but he recorded over it to get his message out. And that's why the clip that made it to the media, at least the clip that I saw, started with 2 or 3 seconds of a little girl twirling about in all innocence, before it was interrupted by a man at a desk in fear for his life, for his family, and in fear for the fate of his country, but full of resolution. To bring this up to date, you will have seen in the first broadcasts of Volodymyr Zelensky a similar sort of resolution. It's funny how, as they say, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Another thing the plotters hadn't thought of, apart from the tape, was that they'd arrested Gorbachev, but not Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin went straight to the centre of Moscow, climbed on one of the hundreds of tanks that had suddenly appeared on the streets and in Red Square, and he delivered a speech urging Russians to resist and to fight. They did. They got out into the streets and threw up barricades, and for 3 days Russia was in an excited turmoil of freedom and possibilities and somehow a fresh start. And of course, the ones who blinked first were the coup plotters, who realised they didn't have the country with them. The communist myth had been exploded, and they must have also realised that there are only so many handcuffs they could make. They let Gorbachev go, Yeltsin took over, and within 4 months, the Soviet Union was no more. It was just shocking. I had been brought up with the idea of the eternity of the Soviet Union, and there it was, evaporating. You might now think that the Russian people would honour Gorbachev as a great hero, and no doubt some of them do and did, but many more couldn't forgive him for those 10 years of chaos that followed that 1991 coup. And the loss of Russian power in the world that came with it. Putin was particularly irked by him and kept him well away. So Gorbachev lived his last years in a sort of exile, a spiritual exile. He was in Russia, but nobody wanted to talk to him. I'm sorry Gorbachev died at this awful juncture of a repressive dictatorship that has taken over his beloved country. He was an honest idealist, and he must have been viewing with anguish the unfolding tragedy of the Putin dictatorship and the isolation of a country he'd risked so much to open up. I'm pretty sure he might have survived a bit longer, but that his death was hastened by a broken heart, although it might have been hastened by Putin as well. Okay, well, that's it. I'm granniopteryx. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds. Please like, share and subscribe. Please support my channel if you can. The links are below this video. And yeah, till next time.